Welcome to the Healing Trauma Podcast, a space for those who are healing from complex and developmental trauma. Introducing your host, Monique Coven, a certified trauma recovery coach, survivor, and thriver. The intent of the podcast is to provide helpful information with insight that can validate, encourage, and support you on your healing journey. You're going to hear stories from other survivors and trauma experts, featuring therapists, coaches, and practitioners. We will open up the conversation on effective trauma healing modalities, practices, and tools. If you are interested in trauma recovery coaching, as well as recommended books and healing resources, head over to www.thehealingtraumapodcast.com. And now, here is your host, Monique Coven.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. On today's episode, I'm going to share with you a really great conversation I had with therapist Dr. Peter Salerno. And we're going to be talking specifically about how trauma can impact your body and mind and relationships when you are a first responder. I think that often when we think of trauma, we think of childhood trauma and its impact on the body and brain and relationships, or we think of one-time events. So we're going to be exploring how trauma can impact a person and their relationships, specifically in the line of work with first responders. I hope you find this episode helpful, and if you know anyone who is in this line of work, you can forward them this episode, and I hope that they will find it helpful as well. Hi, Peter. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I am, as we were chatting just a little bit before, I was telling you that this is the first time I'm having a subject that's not directly related to childhood trauma. Most of the topics I've had throughout the years have been childhood trauma.
Mhm.
But when you approached me with the title of your book, Fit for Off Duty, and you were talking about trauma and first responders, right away I could relate because one of our best friends is a paramedic, and I watched his career and his day-to-day life, and I saw that he really did experience trauma. So I would love to get into that with you, talking about how this type of work, this line of work, first responders, there's a lot of trauma involved in this kind of
Mhm.
work. So, and you're talking, let's also state that you're coming to this as a therapist, as a trauma specialist, a professional, but you're
Mhm.
also coming in a personal way. You are the son of maybe I'll let you finish that.
Sure. I'm the son of a fire captain, and then my older brother is also a firefighter.
Right, right.
Mhm.
So, I mean, I guess living with the experience of, first of all, growing up with a dad and seeing some of the responses and behaviors, is that what kind of got you into therapy, becoming a therapist, and then having an interest in working with first responders?
Absolutely. My dad actually became a firefighter when I was 7 years old. So there was a pretty big transition in our family system. Him coming from just working 9 to 5 and in a safe environment to, all of a sudden becoming a firefighter. And actually, when he was hired, he was still on probation when he had to go to Los Angeles to help out with the LA riots back in 1992.
Mm.
So his initiation to the job was extremely traumatic and stressful. And then we were home, not really knowing, you know, the magnitude of what was going on there. So it was pretty scary. It shook up our family uh, to have him, you know, transition into that line of work.
I'm just thinking of you as at first the idea when he introduced himself as I'm going to be a firefighter. Did you think that that was like, oh wow, my dad's going to be so cool? He's going to be putting out. I don't know. What was your little boy's mindset?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, little boys kind of idealize
Mhm.
firefighters as heroes, and it looks really cool and fun even.
Mhm.
Um, and one of the main draws, I think, for a lot of families is that their schedule allows them to be home in a capacity that's kind of different than people who have to work, 5 days a week, 9 to 5 or whatever. So it was exciting that we were thinking we were gonna have a lot more time with dad, and we were going to be able to go on lots of vacations and do all that kind of stuff. And that sort of glamorous, idealized view is kind of quickly i- sort of we get disillusioned pretty quickly when the reality of it sinks in. It's really not like that at all. Uh, so, but as a kid, it was exciting at first. I'll
Mhm.
just say that.
So did you notice like a noticeable difference in your dad's behavior from, I mean, you said you were 7, from what he
Mhm.
was like before with the other job, the safe, predictable job versus this?
I did actually. I think me specifically, I don't think it's a coincidence I got into this line of work. I
Mm.
typically am uh, sort of that play that mediator role, very intuitive.
Mhm.
And so I was experiencing some pretty subtle shifts in just the relationship dynamic, the behaviors, mannerisms, just the overall mood, emotional climate in the house, changed pretty subtly, but also overtly. And I was picking up on that pretty consciously at an early age.
Mm.
And there's definitely like a divide from my life before he became a firefighter to after. It's pretty distinct in my mind and memory.
Mm,
So,
that's what I was wondering.
mhm.
So, why are you focusing on like trauma and first responders specifically in your book? Why did you decide to write this book?
Yeah, it's a great question. I originally well, I do a lot of work with first responders in my practice. So I work with law enforcement, I work with firefighters. And what I was noticing is they would come in and I would kind of do some education on kind of the process of therapy, the process of healing, and sort of the interventions and stuff like that. And a lot of them would not come back. Um, Pretty common for in first responder culture not to seek out help in the first place.
Mm.
So just getting them in the room is quite a big deal. But I noticed a lot of them weren't coming back for a follow-up.
Mm.
So what I started to do is I started to kind of draft some documents that I would send home with them that were sort of informative on the process. And I noticed that they would come back for a follow-up if I had given them something solid, or like a hard copy of something concrete that they could go over on their own.
Mhm.
And as I started realizing what was happening, it seemed like when they were in the office, they were perceiving threat.
Mm.
And so when we perceive threat, our rational thinking shuts down. And so they would leave and probably not have a good reason to come back. And all they remember probably is that it was uncomfortable, even if I gave them some great information on, how I could help. But when I gave them something to go home and kind of marinate on and digest when they were safe in their own environment, I noticed they would be more willing to return and do the work. And so that's sort of how the book became a thing. I just started writing it over time and handing little like pamphlets and snippets out until it became um, an entire book that I could publish. So,
Yeah, I love that, and I did read your book, and I felt that it was very very clear and very like easy, like kind of like what you're describing. It was digestible, and I like the way you said about them coming in and having that threat response, especially if this is not something that they're comfortable with. You did talk about that in the book too, about this environment of, uh, firefighters not feeling comfortable um, showing feelings or saying that things might be difficult. And so, yeah, even coming for help,
Hmm.
they must feel so uncomfortable and, yeah, it being a threat.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So, how is trauma defined or described in your book that would be, let's say, more geared towards this population of first responders?
Yeah. So in my book, I tried to find a concise, uh, not necessarily a definition, but a good explanation for this population because um, I wanted it to make sense in a way that had less to do with, I mean, when people think of trauma, obviously childhood trauma, abuse, those types of things come to mind. But the work related trauma, the exposure for first responders is really um, this the result of this overwhelming nervous system response to the threat, like on a call, and then later on to the perceived threat, which remembering the call or getting activated by something that triggers a memory of the call. So first responders are constantly exposed to critical incidents
Mhm.
um, that cause brain and body changes. And these changes occur when their nervous systems get activated. So I really wanted to highlight, you know, I think people even in first responders will use the term trauma to describe like a brain injury or something that happens in an accident, something that's like a physical, injury. But I wanted to make sure that there was this understanding that every time your nervous system is activated to the point where it's overwhelmed, you could potentially start to develop signs or symptoms of being traumatized.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I got when I was reading it. I was like, this sounds a lot like the exact same process that happens with repetitive trauma in childhood. Yes, the brain of the first responder is fully developed, so you don't have the
Hmm.
developmental piece, but being exposed, over and over and over again to overwhelm, it's
Hmm.
the same process in the body.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the same
Hmm.
response.
Yeah.
So yeah, and I, like I said when we started, I can relate because one of our best friends, I mean, the stories that he would share were horrific, like your worst
Hmm.
nightmares, and having to, like, he's a paramedic, so he'd be the first one on there, and you see a mother hysterical or whatever, and that's horrifying. And he was a young dad, at the time of this particular thing, and I'm thinking, how can that not affect you?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm.
What are some of the, would you say, some of the misconceptions about trauma, maybe in general, and how it's treated?
So I think a lot of people, and myself included in my degree programs, I wasn't actually taught how to treat trauma the way that I needed to be taught.
Mhm.
So obviously I had to get, um, enhance my skill set, enhance my training. And I think there's this misconception that you can just go to any therapist, any coach,
Mhm.
any doctor, any psychiatrist and say, I'm having work related stress and help, and it's going to be the same. So there's this misconception that like talk therapy, for example, is a valid treatment for trauma. Unfortunately, it's not in and of itself. It's just the way it is. So cognitive treatments. I was actually trained psychodynamically. That was kind of the theoretical, orientation that I was given in school. Doesn't do anything for trauma.
Right.
So the cognitive and the kind of emotion focused treatments, they don't heal trauma because when we're traumatized, the neocortical functioning is shut down. Our rational thinking capacity is shut down. So to have someone in an office talk to you for an hour, and you trying to get them to change their thoughts or their way of thinking, it's pretty much useless as far as helping them. And so I think that's actually a deterrent for a lot of people like first responders. They don't want to come in and just talk. And the good news is that's not going to help anyway, so they don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
So that's one of what I've experienced as one of the biggest misconceptions is that people will come in and just assume,
Yeah.
I'm going to talk for an hour. You're going to give me some homework. And then all of a sudden these flashbacks or nightmares or whatever are just going to kind of go away. And that's just not the case. So,
Yeah. And as I was mentioning, when I had asked my friend once, would you ever be interested in coming on the podcast and talking? It's like, nope. So that was just an indication that, nope, not going to go there, which we understand.
mhm,
Why would I want to touch into something that might be really painful to bring up again? So that's good to know that that they don't have to come in and talk about it.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
Mhm.
good. So, what impact would you say does trauma have on the body of a first responder or anybody or anyone who's really like a first responder that's exposed to a crisis?
Well, I like that you said crisis, because first responders, when they're on duty, they're always in crisis mode. And what crisis mode does is it it takes our typical stress response, which is a good thing, and it overwhelms it. It pushes it over the threshold to an over arousal. So with a first responder's nervous system, they can experience the fight or flight, which is the sympathetic dominance, or they can experience something that's less known actually to them. I do a lot of education on this because a lot of people aren't aware that there's also a parasympathetic stress response, which is and I know you've interviewed people on here about polyvagal theory,
Yeah, shut down.
the dorsal vagal shutdown.
Mhm.
So it's actually your parasympathetic, your rest and digest system that's getting overwhelmed, and it causes that freeze response. I've seen that. I've seen both of those occur in first responders, and what's kind of unique to them is that on switch is on duty so that they can do their job, and then it's on off duty, and that's one of the main goals in treating a first responder is how do I turn that on switch back to off when I'm in civilian mode, domestic mode, so that I can relate to my family, I can relate to my kids without bringing the trauma response into that environment. So I'm not going to say that that's 100% unique to first responders. I think anybody's who's traumatized their switch is on.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. It's the same thing as someone
Mhm.
who's, they have that elevated response just to life in general. It's higher. And but I guess I didn't really realize that that same thing happens when you have work like that where you're consistently in front of a crisis. But that makes sense if you're constantly in crisis mode, as many of us were in childhood,
Mhm.
um, you would continue to be hyper vigilant, on edge, all of those
Right.
things. Yeah.
And what I've seen specific to first responders is they don't know that that's what's happening in them, and their inclination is they feel more comfortable at work. So this can be pretty problematic for families who misunderstand. They start to make the assumption that the first responder wants to be at work more than with the family. They'll sign up for overtimes. What's actually happening is they feel more comfortable at work because they have a way to channel that energy that's overwhelming the system.
Mhm,
Whereas when they're off duty, sitting down, doing something kind of more of a domestic activity,
mhm,
they're crawling out of their skin. They can't sit still.
mhm,
And it feels like it makes more sense for them to have all of those stress hormones that are kind of coursing through their bloodstream to be put to use on duty. So
mhm,
that I would say sort of unique to anybody that's in a line of work where they're doing crisis intervention or dealing with critical incidents.
mhm.
Is it can start to feel more comfortable being activated and hyper aroused to the point where leisure activities and off duty time is not very enjoyable.
Mm. I can kind of see that too with some people in a sense of just relating it to a lot of people who have had childhood trauma have difficulty being in peace or being in quiet.
Yeah.
It's sort of the same thing. They
Yes.
don't feel safe in that space, and they want to go do something. They want to go distract. They it's their body is just like, oh, right.
Hmm.
Yeah. What impact does it actually have on the brain?
Hmm. So trauma memories are not encoded in the brain the way that other memories are. Trauma memories essentially are trapped in the amygdala, or the threat detector part of the brain, in the limbic region, while other memories, like maybe a memory of doing this podcast, for example,
Mhm.
it's going to be encoded in a way where it's going to become a hippocampal memory. So we can recall it voluntarily. When we recall it, it's not going to give us any distress. And when we sleep tonight, our brain is going to do what it needs to do with it. It's going to store it, into the long-term memory bank, essentially, and archive it.
Mhm.
Trauma memories don't get archived. They stay in the inbox, so to speak. So they're always fighting to kind of get resolved, and that's what causes the flashbacks or the triggers, those types of occurrences, because they're actually still fresh in the emotional region of the brain. And that's why they become problematic, is they come up on their own. We're not in control of when we recall them. And that's essentially, how I would sort of try to uh, describe the difference between a memory that gets encoded as traumatic versus a memory that's just something that can easily get stored and resolve itself.
If you'd like to find out more about trauma recovery coaching with me, you can visit my website at thehealingtraumapodcast.com. There you'll find a variety of ways that we could work together. So I'm just wondering, for one of the things that you mentioned in the book, and I said, I mean, I try to do the same thing with my own clients and here on the podcast. And I love the way you described how when you work with someone and you begin to tell them and explain that what they're experiencing is not abnormal, but it's really an adaptation, that they feel great relief.
Mm-hmm.
So do you want to talk about that a bit?
Sure. That actually came from the fact that, uh, in my diagnostic manual,
Mhm.
um, this post-traumatic stress, or trauma, is referred to as a disorder. I don't like that word. Um, One of the reasons is because the whole reason for that word in the first place is it's like a linguistic convenience for people who are supposed to be reading that manual. It's not necessarily supposed to be shared with the public or the client, and it shouldn't be information that's public domain, even though, with the internet nowadays, people are diagnosing themselves with all kinds of things. Um, it would be abnormal if somebody wasn't
Yeah.
impacted by an adverse experience. So I wouldn't consider that a disorder. I would consider that, adaptive. Um,
Mhm.
I think that brings a lot of relief to people, because, even myself, I wouldn't want to go seek help and then be told that I'm mentally ill because I experienced something on the job, where I was trying to help, and then the environmental stimuli was so overwhelming that it's almost like you say it's like you're telling people, you go to work, you're going to catch an illness.
Mm.
Um, and so I don't really view it that way. So I try to use different terminology that makes more sense, and doesn't involve this sort of harsh, kind of labeling, because I would think that if you weren't impacted by the things that you see as a first responder, that might be problematic, you know?
And that's a relief. So you tell me, take this a little further. How would it be problematic?
I would question someone's capacity to experience empathy.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
You
Exactly.
know, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
so,
Mhm.
and there are people out there who have that deficit,
Yeah,
and aren't fazed by things that are, considered the worst experiences for others.
exactly, exactly.
Um,
So
So
what a relief. So what a relief,
yeah,
to know
yeah,
that and I love that how you went into depth about, not being a disorder. Such a relief. I mean, the environment, the experience, the horror, that was where the abnormal or the disorder, that was disorderly, not
right,
your response to it.
exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's so much relief in that. Yeah.
Hmm.
I love that. So, I don't know if you answered this question. I might be repeating myself, but how do first responders experience trauma specifically? Like
Hmm.
how does it show up?
So we can actually become traumatized through any of our five senses,
Mhm.
right? So each first responder, and I think this is specific to the individual, but I've worked with a lot of first responders who the worst thing that they remember is something that they heard. I've worked with first
Mm,
responders who said the worst thing that they remember is something that they saw. I've heard the worst thing that they experienced is something that they smelled, right? So I think what's unique to them is they're exposed and they're on calls all the time
mm,
where they are exposed to all of this sensory stimuli. And so there's all of these different ways in which the trauma can enter into their system and activate the stress response, activate the nervous system. Not to say that that's not something that's common to everybody, but because they can pretty much guarantee that there's going to be some sort of an environmental stimuli that's going to cue in a reaction um, and the types of things. So if you're talking about a firefighter, um, like a wildland firefighter, for example, they smell smoke all the time. They smell things burning.
mm,
I don't remember the last time I smelled something burning. So there's certain environmental experiences that they have that are specific to them that they can guarantee they're going to have. And then depending on the individual, that sensory information can enter into their system and potentially cause problems for them later on.
mm. That makes sense. Yeah. I mean, you just described the fires and I was smelling it. So I can imagine
Mm,
I can imagine them.
hmm.
Yeah. And then what's unique to them and their families? Like what's yeah.
I go over this a little bit in the book. I think it's very brief, but I talk about vicarious trauma. Um, I haven't I haven't yet worked with a first responder whose family wasn't impacted by vicariously. So essentially, the traumatized person comes home to their attachment relationships, and their attachment relationships are sort of if they are traumatized, the attachment relationships are compromised because the social engagement is decreased,
Mhm.
or it's not the most safe, the most vulnerable. And so um, the family members are experiencing this new version, this adapted version of their loved one in a way where it basically alters the safety of the family system in lots of ways. I mean, it depends. I know you've done a lot of um, a lot about childhood trauma. So depending on the developmental stage the child's in, that can severely impact just being in close proximity to the traumatized person can severely impact the development of the child. Um, the relationship, the marital relationship or partnership, can be severely compromised. What I've noticed, because first responders are taught to suck it up, a lot of times avoidant attachment becomes a pretty prominent aspect of the relationships. Coping in ways that aren't helpful that can also impact the family. So if there's any sort of maladaptive coping, whether it's you know self-medicating or keeping busy or whatever, um, that can also impact the family system as a whole. So those are just a few kind of examples of how the family's impacted.
I know you said you give a lot of education, psychoeducation, which is super helpful, but what is the modality that you use with them for trauma to process some of the trauma?
Yeah. So something that's really popular, and I know it's been discussed on your podcast before and probably will be again.
Yes.
Um, but EMDR is a very popular treatment technique for first responders because a lot of the first responders are coming in um, with either like a single incident trauma, like maybe one particular call that they just really struggled with, or a cumulative trauma that is thematic though. So it's like a lot of calls of the same nature where it's sort of created a theme. And those two types of traumas can be really kind of targeted and successfully treated with EMDR. So that's typically my go-to for when I'm working with first responders. Another reason is because it's typically short-term in nature when you're dealing with like a work-related trauma. It's different with childhood trauma or complex, trauma. It essentially is a short-term way to kind of unlock those trauma memories we were discussing earlier and kind of consolidate them and put them where they need to be so that the person can just get back to work essentially. So a lot of my work that I do is somebody's coming in just because there's a particular call or a particular event that they want to specifically target, and EMDR really
Mhm.
does wonders for that type of situation.
And you've seen, like, maybe you can talk about without giving names, um,
Yeah.
so that we can get a little idea maybe of someone who came to see you and some where they had some relief.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna be completely honest. When I first heard about EMDR, I didn't know what to think. I didn't really believe something like that could be so effective
Mm.
until I saw it for myself. And I've worked with first responders who've come in, just for 2 or 3 sessions, and um, as long as they agreed to, be vulnerable, kind of give themselves permission to heal, to do the process, to take directives, and um, follow the protocol, so to speak. Uh, they at least reported to me that they had a distress level of like a 10 when they came to see me, and then after our processing, they had a distress level of 0, and
What?
they
Wow.
they could recall the memory of the event, of the call, and with 0 distress. Um,
That's incredible. That's so
it
great to hear.
and it's so rewarding to see and to experience when someone comes in, and part of the EMDR process is we vet that. We see, did this really work? Did this really stick? So I intentionally will try to activate them with their permission, of course. And and to see that there's no physiological response to what a week or 2 before was so distressing they could barely, verbalize. It's incredible.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so they bring up the memory and then you do the bilateral stimulation with them while they're talking
Yes.
about it?
So they typically will pick a memory, an
Mhm,
event, um, and then we'll target the worst part of it.
mhm.
So I'll have them kind of go to the worst part. Um, Typically there's a belief about themselves associated with that. So we try to identify the belief. Then we choose a more positive or adaptive belief that they would want to link to the memory instead of the negative one. Um, we label the emotion associated with it, where it's felt in the body, and the distress level on a scale of 0 to 10, 10 being the worst. Um, and then we have them uh, basically focus, like roll that all up, into a ball, hold on to it, intentionally focus on that so that the system gets activated the way it was originally. And then we run the bilateral stimulation, and um, essentially they just say whatever came to mind during the bilateral technique. And then we basically do that until they start to have more clarity, more like the thinking brain gets back online. There's links, associations to the trauma where it was originally fragmented. Now it's more coherent, it's more clear. And then they just start having the ability to create a new narrative about it until the new belief is actually believable. And in doing that, it reduces the distress level to the point where they can now intentionally try to look at the memory, and it's lacking that
Charge.
intensity, the charge. Great
Oh,
word. It lacks the charge.
yeah,
Um, mhm.
that's really, really great. So, is there anything unique about being like anything else you want to say that's unique about being a first responder and trauma that you think is important to share?
I think when we talk about, I mean, it's really been a problem, this suck it up mentality.
Yeah.
And it's been a problem from from supervisors in first responder world. Like, if you need to take time off for work related stress, like, you might as well just, hang it up and quit because you can't handle it. And that has proven to be extremely dangerous. Not only dangerous, but life threatening. Suicide rates are high, um, for first responders. Um, Substance use, self medicating in ways that are really damaging. And I I'm not going to be placing blame on anybody, but I would say, if there was an openness and a vulnerability to, admitting, like, hey, our nervous systems are shot and we can't really, there's nothing we can do. That's just part of the human condition that has nothing to do with, being tough.
Hmm.
Um, that can literally prevent, um, tragedies from happening. So I think, um, slowly but surely, I think there's a bit more of an openness to seeking help now. It's less of a stigma, but it's still there. And, whereas somebody in a different profession who doesn't necessarily have a reputation to uphold, if they're having problems, they'll go seek help because they just want to feel better. There's no obstacle. So I would say what's unique is somebody who's told their whole life that they're just supposed to figure out a way to deal, and they're supposed to somehow have superhuman powers to do that. Um, I think that is something that's unique in the first responder community that needs to kind of be, we need to start kind of chipping away at that stigma.
I'm thinking like before that, there needs to be trauma informed education given to first responders, supervisors, all of them, so
Hmm.
that first of all, they know that this is to be expected. You're going to be facing experiences that are going to be overwhelming for your system. This is normal. Like,
Yes.
and that you may need some support after.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think now, professional resilience training prior to even being exposed to the traumas that they're going to, I think it would be a good idea to teach people, how to self-regulate, how to interrupt threat responses, how to do things that while they're on duty, you don't have to be hyper vigilant. You can be self-regulated and cautious, right? I mean, there's a difference. So teaching them those ways of being in tune with themselves, with their bodies, um, where they're regulating while they're in the danger, interrupting the threat response before it, becomes toxic stress and kind of, you know, has a mind of its own, becomes more of an automatic process. I
Yeah.
think we can do a lot to educate first responders in that regard.
This just popped into my mind now, and I'm thinking about now, a lot of people have had childhood trauma. And if they then choose a career like that, I mean, it, I'm thinking they're going to be having to do they're going to need a lot of support.
Yeah, so childhood trauma, prior to a job like this significantly increases the likelihood of, kind of more poor coping strategies.
Definitely.
So,
Yeah.
um, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with the ACE scale, the adverse childhood experiences. Just scoring a 1 out of 10 on that, and then going into a work like this, significantly increases difficulties when dealing with stress. I mean,
Yeah.
so
Well, thank you for a very interesting conversation. And, I hope people will share it if they know someone who's a first responder. It could be really, really helpful for them and their families. So, thank you. And thank you for the work that you do. If people are interested in your book or in your resources, I will link your book to the show notes and your
thank you.
website as well. It was a pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.